Cravings happen. We've all been there. You're 1 week into a diet, you're making progress, and you say to yourself, this time it's going to be different. I'm going to have crazy discipline, no more cheating. And then it happens. Seemingly out of nowhere, you get a hankering for like an ice cream bar. It quickly becomes the only thing that you think about for the rest of the day. You just can't get this thought out of your head, so what do? You start to rationalize. Well, one treat won't hurt. I've been really good this week. I deserve this. I've already lost 2 pounds this week, so one bar can't be that bad. So you stop and you get your treat, you eat it, and you expect the craving to go away. But it doesn't. In fact, you've just started a tirade of more cravings. Now you want a burger with a side of pizza stuffed in a deep fried chicken. Your cravings get worse, and before you know it, your cheat meal turned into a cheat weekend. Monday rolls around and you feel horrible, and you just beat yourself up for what happened. What you just experienced is the reality that most Americans face when they're trying to lose weight. Cravings are a real thing, and they can derail your progress and mentally screw you if you don't handle them correctly. In this report, I want to talk about where cravings come from, why they occur, and how we can destroy them once and for all. But before we dive in, I want to share 2 anecdotes. My most successful weight loss attempt of losing 60 pounds was riddled with temptations and cravings. Almost daily, I struggled with the thoughts of treats, candy, and frankly, foods I didn't even like, but I still craved them. I got the job done. I lost 60 pounds in 6 months, but there was this mental baggage the entire time. Now, the second time that I needed to lose a significant amount of weight was when I was getting ready for my first bodybuilding competition. I lost about 40 pounds of accumulated body fat from bulking and getting bigger from over the years, which wasn't effective. We'll cover that in another video. 40 pounds in 4 months, and I had 0 cravings. Now, my bodybuilding prep was more aggressive and more challenging than my first cut, and yet I didn't feel any temptations or cravings. Mentally, it was the easiest cut I've ever done. So what happened? Why was my bodybuilding prep easier than the first cut? Why was one cut riddled with cravings and temptations, and the other cut was relatively smooth sailing? It all came down to how I handled those cravings and how I structured my diet. So in this report, I'll explain the science behind the cravings and the actionable strategies we can use to eliminate them for good. And wait till the end because I'll tell you exactly how I was able to do the bodybuilding prep with 0 cravings. But you might figure it out as you go along. So where do cravings come from? What's going on in our brain while we're having a craving? Why do cravings seem to hit so hard when we're dieting? And how can we stop mindless eating from derailing our progress? First, we need to understand the habit loop. And this all starts with a trigger or a cue. The cue is the stimulus that triggers our brain to start a behavior. This could be a location, could be a time of day, it could be an emotional state, or some other stimulus. The cue tells the brain to go into default mode, and this initiates a routine that has been associated with this cue in the past. First there's cue, then there's routine. The routine is the actual behavior that follows the cue. This is the habit itself. Whether it's a completely physical action, an emotional response, or other mental activity, the routine can be simple or complex, ranging from biting your nails to a full-blown panic attack. So when the brain recognizes the cue, it initiates the routine. Finally, the reward. The reward is the positive reinforcement that follows after the routine. This usually results in a higher level of dopamine. This could be anything that satisfies a craving, the pleasure of scrolling through your phone for an hour, or the feeling of having a cigarette. The reward helps the brain remember and prioritize the habit for future repetitions. After completing the routine, the brain receives the reward in the form of dopamine. This provides satisfaction or relief, and this solidifies the behavior as worth repeating. So the habit loop operates in a cycle. It starts with a cue, a trigger in your environment that signals a behavior. Next is routine. The behavior is performed in response to the cue. And then finally, reward, a positive feeling or satisfaction that follows the behavior, which solidifies the routine. Over time, this cycle becomes automatic. The brain learns to anticipate the reward as soon as the cue is triggered, which makes the routine feel almost effortless. This is why habits can be so hard to break. Our brains are wired to constantly seek rewards, even if we know the routine, like smoking, binge eating, procrastinating, is actually harmful. So now that we understand the habit loop, we can talk about what causes the trigger of a craving. At the core of food cravings is the reward system of the brain. And this particularly involves the dopamine pathway. When we consume hyperpalatable, hyperprocessed foods, dopamine is released in the nucleus accumbens, which is a key reward center in the brain circuitry. This creates a sense of pleasure or satisfaction, and it reinforces the desire to seek out these foods. So in short, we eat pleasurable foods, dopamine floods the brain's reward centers, which makes us feel good in the moment. This flood of dopamine strengthens that neural connection, and now we associate that food with positive feelings and feeling good. Now I want to talk about the opioid system activation. So now, along with dopamine, the opioid system plays a major role in food cravings, particularly for hyperprocessed, hyperpalatable foods. When consuming foods high in fat and sugar, the brain releases endogenous opioids, which are like neural painkillers, which produces a pleasurable sensation. This is essentially why drugs like morphine work. Again, this can create a reinforcing loop. The cravings are driven by the desire to experience these opioid-related pleasures again. These interconnected systems explain why food cravings are so powerful and why hyperpalatable foods can lead to this repetitive cycle that is impossible to break. So we've explored a little bit of the neuroscience of why cravings occur. Hopefully now you understand that it's a lot more complex than just lack of willpower, or you're just not trying hard enough. You're literally evolved to develop cravings. Fighting cravings means we're fighting our very primal instincts to survive. Fighting primal responses is difficult, but it's not impossible. So now that we understand the science behind cravings, we can put together a plan to fight and even eliminate these cravings for good. Okay, here are the steps. Step number 1, we're going to identify the triggers. So we know now that cravings don't just randomly happen. There's always a trigger. It doesn't make sense for the brain to expend energy to send a trigger for a routine if there wasn't a stimulus. So the first key to eliminating the craving is identify the habit loop. Where is the cue or trigger coming from? So the first step is simply to be more mindful. This might look like slowing down and paying attention to what's going on in your mind. Now, this is a skill that I've had to actually develop through journaling and meditation. So don't feel bad if you can't pinpoint exactly where your thoughts are coming from, or if mindfulness seems difficult for you. But with practice, we can get better. So when you feel the craving come up, just take a moment to breathe. Ask yourself these questions. What feelings or emotions am I feeling right now? What changed in my environment that could have caused this trigger to come up? What sights, smells, or sounds have led to this trigger? Am I hungry, thirsty, tired? Am I stressed, sad, bored? Now, I can't give an exact answer of where your cravings are coming from. I'm not a mind reader. I'm still working on that skill. However, we can go through some common triggers that might align with where these cravings are coming from. Let's start with environmental triggers. These could look like sensory cues, sight, smells, tastes. So when you're exposed to these specific sensory cues, the brain associates these with past pleasurable experiences, which activates the reward system, prompting the cravings. Then there's social settings. Certain social environments can trigger the food cravings. Social cues, such as walking into a different room, being around other people who are eating, or even being offered food when you're not even hungry. Then there's time of day. Cravings often occur at the same time of day, and this is usually tied to habitual eating patterns. Late night cravings, for example, are very common, even though the body doesn't need extra calories. And then there's routine and habits. So cravings can be tied to certain daily habits, such as having a specific snack while watching TV, or associating a particular activity with eating. Kind of like the whole meme where after a really good sex session, you have a cigarette. Same kind of thing. So those are the environmental triggers that could be leading to the craving. There's also emotional triggers. Many people crave comfort foods as a way to deal with stress, boredom, anxiety, depression, or even happiness. So let's talk about stress and anxiety. Stress is one of the most common emotional triggers. So when stressed, your body releases cortisol, which is a hormone that can increase your appetite. And stress-induced cravings are often a way for the body to seek comfort and to relieve tension. So ask yourself, am I feeling stressed or overwhelmed? Is there a healthier, more satisfying way to manage my stress than to eat garbage food? Next is boredom. Boredom can lead to mindless eating. When there is nothing to occupy the mind, the brain turns to food to fill that void. And I'll be honest, in today's day and age, we are very bad at being bored. Like, being bored is a skill now. Every single second it has to be filled with entertainment. Think about it. You can't even wait in line at the store without pulling out your phone. You can't even sit on the toilet without your phone. So we're not very good at being bored. So if you find yourself bored and you're not doing anything, of course the cravings are going to show up. Next is sadness or depression. Sugary and fatty foods can momentarily boost serotonin levels, which offers a temporary relief from sadness or depression, which offers temporary relief from loneliness or sadness. Now, if you feel you struggle with depression, I highly recommend that you seek out the help of a mental health professional. Coaching in this sector can be life-changing, and it can have a synergistic effect on your health and your fat loss because we're attacking the issue head on as opposed to addressing the symptom. Fun fact, according to this study, people tend to be leaner when they're happier. So this is something that we can work toward. Next is happiness and reward. Cravings can also be triggered by positive emotions, such as happiness or excitement. Many people associate food with celebrations, and feeling good can prompt cravings for indulgent foods. So then you can ask yourself, is there a way for me to cultivate this happiness that won't result in regret, like eating off plan? How can I magnify these feelings of happiness without the need of food? Last is fatigue. When you're physically or mentally exhausted, cravings for hyperpalatable foods often arise. Fatigue lowers your self-control, and it makes it harder for you to resist cravings. So as you can see, cravings can be heavily dependent on changes in your environment or changes in your emotion. There could be several different cues, but if we can figure out where the cue is coming from, this whole thing becomes so much easier. Step 2, plan ahead. Based off the questions we've asked ourselves, and now that we've identified the cue, we can now create a plan of action. This is where we're going to have to do some brainstorming and troubleshooting to figure out what will work for you, but I'll provide some examples. If you know the office goes to lunch at a specific time, and they bring their foods back to the office to eat, and seeing them eat is what triggers cravings, consider moving your lunch around. You might consider having your lunch before everybody goes out. This would result in you feeling full and less likely to feel those cravings when they come back. If you know that you get stressed at the end of the day, maybe consider planning a workout around that time so that you're occupied and you're not left with those feelings. This would result the craving with a different kind of dopamine and endorphin release. Now, this would actually work twofold because you're not just removing the craving, you're actually replacing that trigger with a new habit that still delivers dopamine for the system. You can use these simple examples for your own plan, but simply identify the cue and create your plan around that cue. I would love to hear your plan in the comments. Maybe we can help each other out here. Step 3, cut the crap out completely. Now, you've heard me say it 1,000 times. When you eat garbage food, you crave garbage food. And this is consistent with the data. Reintroducing hyperpalatable, hyperprocessed foods can aggravate cravings due to their impact on the brain's reward system. Here's how the reintroduction of junk food intensifies cravings. Number 1, dopamine sensitization and reward system activation. Now, like we discussed, hyperpalatable foods trigger dopamine release in the brain. After a period of abstinence from these foods, reintroducing them can cause a heightened dopamine response, making the brain more sensitive and more pleasured by these foods. Now, this heightened response strengthens those neural pathways, which makes them more intense and more frequent. I know this isn't a perfect analogy, but let's take the example of an alcoholic. If someone struggles with alcohol, a good strategy is complete cessation. In fact, the reintroduction of that substance could actually make the problem worse. So it's the same with these extremely hyperpalatable foods. Next is loss of satiety signals. Hyperpalatable foods often interfere with the body's normal satiety signals. Essentially, the feeling of fullness that is impeded by these foods, which leads to overeating. These foods trigger a strong hedonic response, which is pleasure-driven, not survival-driven, and this can override the body's homeostatic hunger signals, which is why it's so difficult to stop eating even when you're full. You know this as the inevitable binge when you have one bite of your craving food and then you can't stop even though you are full. That is hedonic eating. Now, there is light at the end of the tunnel here. When you make the commitment to remove these foods from your diet, you are completely free from your cravings. Why? The brain simply forgets these foods and their associated pleasure signals. There's a reduction in reward response and neural adaptations. When junk food is completely removed from the diet, the brain's reward pathways can begin to desensitize over time. This means that the brain is no longer associating these foods with a high amount of pleasure and reward, which reduces the craving. There's also a change in taste preferences. When the junk food is eliminated from your diet, your palate changes. You actually start to see healthier foods, home-cooked meals as pleasurable as opposed to the junk food. And this makes sense because if you think about hyperpalatable foods, it is engineered to be extremely pleasurable. Companies do this because if they can make it as stimulating for you as possible, they've created a recurring customer. Well, your home-cooked meals are really hard to compete with a multi-billion-dollar industry that's fabricating the perfectly engineered tortilla chip or chocolate chip cookie. So removing these foods brings dopamine levels back to baseline and increases the sensation from normal home-cooked meals. So the cravings for those foods goes away, and then you actually tend to crave more healthier options. You actually crave fruit, you actually crave nuts, you actually crave your own meals that you make at home. So to wrap it up, completely abstaining from junk food reduces the brain's reward response to it. We've reduced the exposure of junk foods, which reduces the craving. Your taste preferences shift, so you no longer want those foods. And then we've broken the routine reward response. When that food is completely eliminated, the brain forgets the reward. Now, there are plenty of people around the world who can have these hyperpalatable, hyperprocessed foods in their diet and keep them under control and not have cravings. But if you're still watching this, you're probably not one of those people. I'm definitely not one of them either. I can't have junk food in my diet. If I have a small morsel of junk food, I can't stop. So I just know for me, don't have it in your diet. Okay, step number 4, we're gonna make the swap. One of the best ways to fight cravings is to replace that pleasure food with something else. Something that still scratches the itch. So if you're craving something sweet, instead of having candy, try fruit or berries with Greek yogurt and almond butter. If you want something salty, opt for air-popped popcorn or roasted chickpeas. Need a crunch? Swap out the chips for some crunchy veggies with some yummy hummus. These swaps will give you the satisfaction of indulging in something without sending you into a complete spiral. Number 5, urge surfing. The good news about cravings and urges is they're not permanent. Just like the waves in the ocean, they come and they go. Why? The brain, frankly, gets bored of sending the same signal and eventually moves on to something else. So your job when these urges come in is not to fight them, it's simply to just ride them out. When the cravings feel unbearable, just remember that you're at the crest of the wave. You just need to last longer than the craving. Learn to ride the urge. Now there's something really important that we need to go over. Giving in to an urge at its highest point is the worst thing that you can do. I'm going to use the example of toddlers. Any parent knows this analogy way too well. So let's say that you have a child and they want to watch TV, and you tell them, no more TV, you've had enough for today. The kid gets angry, they start crying, this doesn't work, you still say no, so the tantrum gets worse. They start to kick and scream, you still say no, but the tirade continues to escalate. The kid is now kicking, screaming, wailing, and gnashing of teeth. Out of desperation, you give in to the kid's protest and you give him the TV. The kid is now silent and happy and your ears can recover. But what you've just done is you've taught your child that in order to get what they want, they need to kick and scream. So now the next time that your kid wants TV, they're not going to ask. They're just going to start throwing a tantrum. And you can't blame them. This is a learned behavior. The best way to teach a child to not throw a tantrum is to not give in to their protests no matter what, because they will learn that the protesting results in no reward. If the routine does not result in a reward, the brain won't form that habit. Managing your cravings works in the exact same way. Your urge is just a toddler wanting something. If you satisfy the urge at its peak, you've now just intensified that urge for the next time around. You must ride these urges even at the highest point. And just like the kid who learns that screaming isn't the answer to get what they want, the brain will learn that sending these urge signals is a futile effort, and they will go away. So now wrapping up, why was my aggressive bodybuilding cut easier than the first cut? Based off of what we covered today, you probably already guessed by now. It was one simple change. I completely eliminated the hyperpalatable, hyperprocessed foods from my diet. In the first cut, I had cheat meals. Those cheat meals would aggravate the cravings, and it actually turned into a few binge sessions. In the bodybuilding prep, I didn't have a single hyperpalatable food. Zero. Sure, in the first few weeks, the cravings were challenging, but as we've discovered, my brain forgot what those foods felt and tasted like. After just a few weeks of riding those urges, the cravings were no more, my stress levels dropped. It was the easiest, most sustainable cut I've ever had. And that's exactly what I want for you. I want you to have the easiest weight loss journey of your life. And I know that will come when we can learn to manage and eliminate these cravings. And the easiest way to do that is to cut the crap out of your diet. You deserve this. You're better than Twinkies and milkshakes. You're worth more than that. You are greater than your cravings. So go surf that urge. Hope this was helpful. Like and comment for more. We'll see you in the next one.